Welcome to the Entrepreneur Show. This is your host, Michael Mara. I'm the CEO and founder of Entre, a social network for entrepreneurs, investors, and freelancers. On this show, we interview the top CEOs, venture capitalists, angel investors, and founders. Connect with me and thousands of other like-minded people by signing up for free at joinentre.com or download our mobile app on iOS and Android. On this episode, I'm interviewing Lyndsey Boucherle. She's a principal at Better Ventures, an early-stage VC firm based out of Oakland, California. They're backing mission-driven founders where she leads their investments in edtech and workforce development. They're focused on solutions supporting underserved communities and enabling access to economic opportunity and mobility. I hope you enjoy the episode. Lyndsey, welcome to the Entrepreneur Show. I'm so glad to have you here. You're obviously not an entrepreneur, but you're on the investing side, which is very important to entrepreneurs. So I love sharing investor stories and learning more about them and their journeys because they help and work with so many entrepreneurs. It's extremely valuable. So Lyndsey, welcome to the show.
Thank you. No, thanks a lot for having me. And as I was doing some prep, I looked back through some of the previous guests, and it was great to see some familiar names, both on the entrepreneur side, but also on the investor side. So yeah, happy to be here and excited for this conversation.
Yeah, we've been very fortunate to interview some amazing people and get connected to, a lot of great entrepreneurs and investors like yourself. I'd love to kick things off and start. I mean, you've done a lot over your career and you're going to continue to do a lot of amazing things. And I definitely want to get into what you're doing now with Better Ventures for sure. But let's talk a little bit more about how you got into the investing space and like why you even chose to get into the investing space. I know you did a lot of stuff at UBS, and then it looks like you went back, got a degree at Stanford for blockchain, and then got into impact investing. So there's a lot to unpack here. And if you don't mind, just like giving people a quick background on yourself and how you got into this whole journey that you're on now on the investing side.
Yeah, very happy to. And also when you kind of tell the story looking back, it sounds a lot clearer of a path than it ever was looking forward. But happy to share that. And that's actually part of why I'm as passionate as I am about supporting startups, specifically in workforce and education as well. So yeah, I did not, intend to end up in finance or certainly venture capital. I would not have even known what that was when I started my career 15 years ago. I really stumbled into the finance world, interestingly. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, which actually is a big banking and finance center. And so kind of grew up surrounded by it as an industry, but frankly thought it all sounded like quite dry and boring. So I didn't start out with a very optimistic view of what working in finance would look like. But as happenstance would have it, my first kind of internship type opportunity was within a bank, and realized that there was a lot more to it than I'd ever thought looking from the outside in. And so I actually was really fortunate. I had always wanted to live abroad and to have kind of a global career. So I actually kicked off my career following that initial internship in Switzerland. So in Zurich, working for UBS. And for those who aren't familiar, UBS is one of the largest global financial institutions. And so once I got in there, kind of realized there was this whole world really within finance, and it wasn't just like what I thought it would be. And yes, everyone's wearing suits, but they're far more interesting than they appear from the outside. So I started there, and even then I kind of thought, oh well, this is something I'll do for a short period of time, and then I'll move on to something else. And I ended up staying at UBS for 12 years, and I've now been in finance for 15. So I think my journey in terms of how it evolved really was kind of a fascination with the power of capital. I had always actually had an interest in the way that technology and capital and resources are utilized for social impact. And we'll go into that a bit, but that's the part of venture capital that I'm in now, is impact focused VC. And so I'd always been really interested in that kind of the transformative power, and yet that intersection of capital, technology and innovation and social impact didn't really exist 15 years ago. So I've had this interest in business and finance that I was exploring through my career and my time at UBS. And then on the side, I was working with a lot of nonprofits, and even at the time was going to a lot of like various founder events, but I didn't really know or see how these things could possibly fit together. It felt more like kind of parallel tracks of interest and development. And it really was only when about 6 years into my career in finance, I was offered a role in Hong Kong. And so moved to Asia, where I then spent the following 6 years. And I think the ecosystem had evolved a bit by that time, but also being in a place like Hong Kong, where in some ways, as a financial center, is so evolved and developed and sophisticated, and yet in many ways, in terms of like entrepreneurship and innovation, was very nascent. And I'd started within UBS doing a lot of work around sustainable investing and the ways that we were supporting social organizations. And then externally from my job, I was going to tons of like startup events, volunteering, working with founders, doing advising and coaching, and started working with a lot of social entrepreneurs, where there was this emerging intersection of kind of early stage entrepreneurship and social impact. And so I was like working with a like recycling startup and a couple others in Hong Kong. And so I started to see that I couldn't see it clearly yet, but that there was maybe something at this intersection of leveraging capital for good effectively. And that there was actually a way to do that that kind of leveraged market forces rather than being contradictory to. So this notion that you can invest in things with impact and generate equal, if not better, returns than the market, and that you could actually leverage technology and innovation in a way to have an even greater impact at scale. So I started kind of exploring all these things, and then ultimately I just felt like I had to kind of step out of that environment and figure this out. And so I left a very stable promising career path, and as you mentioned, went back to school. So I'll pause there because before we go on to kind of the next chapter. That's book one, I guess.
For sure. I love it. And yeah, it seems like you were so ahead of the curve, right? Because like right now, it seems like, every new fund and a lot of investing dollars and new initiatives are focused on this kind of social good and this impact investing. And there's a ton of sustainability and climate tech funds that are popping up all over the place, and it seems like you were very ahead of the curve with it. And it is interesting. Like, what would you say too, because you have a very global perspective on this? You were in Switzerland and then Zurich and also Hong Kong, and obviously the US, and you're in San Francisco now. I'm curious, on a global scale, how have you seen all of this transforming, and are there any things that you're seeing that people are doing in Hong Kong or Europe that are different than the US? And were there any learnings that you got from having this global perspective on it?
Yeah, absolutely. A few things. So one, I would say that certainly each of those regions, and this is, kind of broadly characterizing it, but have evolved in different ways in terms of like areas of innovation. So in Europe, for example, we see in a way they're more advanced than we are in terms of climate technology and climate startups. Part of that's policy and other reasons. But we see actually a lot of advancement in Europe, even more so than here, in Silicon Valley or the US. And in Hong Kong, similarly, being such a banking and finance center, there's been a lot of amazing innovation in fintech and around blockchain and cryptocurrency, and also in e-commerce. Asia is such a different region as it relates to e-commerce. And I think and there are many more areas, obviously, of innovation than those, but that's where I think we often have a kind of insular lens, being not only in the US, but particularly here in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, that we're at the forefront of everything. And I think spending time outside the US certainly provides perspective that, one is that that's not always the case, but also like we miss opportunities too. And even if you look at a lot of the types of companies that are started here in this ecosystem, a lot of them reflect the problems and the challenges from the perspective that you see it sitting in the Bay Area. Certainly that works and obviously can be incredibly successful. But there are also incredible market opportunities that an entrepreneur here will never see. Most of the time, you're building a company solving a problem that exists in your own life, your own market, your own family, your own world. And I think having that global perspective and kind of being reminded of like the bubble that we're in is helpful, but also certainly helps in like identifying opportunities that you might miss otherwise.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's really interesting to see entrepreneurship start scaling everywhere. I mean, the amount of people that I've connected with, all over the world doing really interesting things. It's kind of fascinating. And I'm looking forward to traveling in again and getting out there and starting network in all these different cities throughout the world. And I think, especially in the US, we kind of put ourselves on a pedestal that I think, and we have a bias towards tech, and, rightfully so. At the same time, I think things are changing dramatically. So I think we need to be aware of what other people are doing and what good others are to learn from as we continue, developing as a country as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to your comment about looking forward to traveling again, I mean, even prior to COVID, it had been a while because of Stanford and starting at the fund here. I haven't been back to Hong Kong or to Europe in a number of years now. And so much has changed and evolved since in the entrepreneur ecosystem, in the venture capital ecosystems, in both of those places and regions. And I'm really excited to go back and kind of reconnect there and see, what that progress looks like, because at the time that I was there in both places, it was just incredibly nascent. So it is exciting. And I think that with COVID and more people working remotely, it's opened that up too, in terms of kind of talent, access to talent, in terms of access to opportunity. And I think that's a really exciting thing. So hopefully soon. Haven't gotten back yet, but it's easy to forget what's happening elsewhere depending on what your area of kind of day-to-day focus is professionally.
Yeah, I totally agree. Luckily, with Entre and with all the different entrepreneurs I think we have people from over 150 different countries now on the app, and it's just like, yeah, it's wild you meet people from everywhere, and even our team. I mean, we're a very remote team, and we have people from I think 4 or 5 different countries on our team as well. So it's just cool to see the globalization of tech and startups and what's happening, and just the workforce being global now. I think it creates a lot of opportunity. So let's talk about what made you want to go back to school, because obviously, like, that's a pretty big decision, and it's something that seemed really important and something that you wanted to do. And I'm curious why too, with the emphasis on blockchain. It seemed like that was something that was important for you to learn and start getting into. So let's talk about that and what it was like at Stanford too, because obviously, outside looking in, Stanford's like the spot for, startups and everything. So what was that like?
Yeah, so I mean, the decision to do it, well, I mean, I definitely labored over it. I think also it's like worth highlighting that I didn't go back and do this like in my 20s. I mean, I was like, mid 30s, mid career. So it was not the typical time to step out and go back to school. So, for me, there were a couple things. I mean, one was I actually early in my career had, kind of made a promise to myself, or a commitment to myself, that after 10 years, I wanted to, if I was able to do so, like reinvest in my education. I love learning. It's part of what drives me, just kind of a general curiosity and love for learning. And I'd always wanted the opportunity to go back and learn at some point later in my life, when I felt that I would approach it differently than, at 18. So that was kind of a lingering thing for me, of just like wanting to take a step out, like almost kind of give myself a mid-career sabbatical to reassess and to learn again. And part of it was that I had this just, voice, this itch, like call it what you will, that I knew I wanted to be doing something with my career that had impact, much more squarely into focus. And thus far, it had always been kind of on the periphery. And I just felt really strongly that I wanted to find a way to combine my career, my time, my resources with social impact, and find a way to do that in a way that didn't feel like a trade-off. that it was like, it's again, like this kind of like my general premise, I guess, is like the belief that it's possible to do both and be aligned in that way. So I had these two, kind of lingering things for me of just feeling like there was something more and something different that I wanted to be doing with my career and ultimately with my life. And I'd started to kind of hone in, as I mentioned, on this like intersection. And yet I really didn't know what was there. I'd been out of the US at this point for 12 years. I had never been really certainly not in the Bay Area or Silicon Valley, but really like been in an ecosystem that had such an emphasis on entrepreneurship and startups. And so I kind of just felt like the only way I could really figure this out would be to just take a jump and like, jump right into the center of it all and was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to do that. And I would say, I kind of arrived to Stanford a little naively, especially for an American. I probably didn't have like the same level of awareness or association with what that even really meant, other than like I knew I'd been following the startup world for a long time. I knew that Stanford was kind of like or one of the places to be, but I kind of showed up like very wide-eyed and a little naive about like what was actually happening here. So yeah, it is. I mean, I don't know where everyone is on this call. I wish I could kind of like ask or see, but it is an incredible environment in terms of just like the energy around innovation and technology and startups. It certainly is, and at Stanford specifically. I think that there's, as I said, like there's an element of that can become a bit of a bubble. It's like you sort of feel like everyone wants to be an entrepreneur and start a company. And as we all know, that's not everyone is actually meant to do that or cut out for that. But there's like, you kind of get in this world where you feel like if you don't start and build a big company and an IPO, then what are you doing with your life? So there's a lot of pretty interesting like pressure, I think, in this part of the world too, but absolutely fascinating place to be. And really it was, in getting there, it was really only actually when I got there that I started to get some clarity around seeing that there was a niche intersection of these elements that I was looking for. And it was through my time at Stanford that I kind of slowly started zeroing in on what that looked like and how I ended up at Better Ventures, and really used my time there kind of as a series of experiments. And the blockchain piece was one of those, where I basically said, okay, I have this period of time to figure this out. I'm kind of like taking apart the pieces of what I've done so far. I know that I want these elements and what I do next, but I don't actually know if that's possible or what that looks like and what does that mean in terms of an actual job. And so I ran kind of like a series of experiments I looked at kind of the intersection of like venture and philanthropy, which is a little bit different just in terms of it's more like debt than equity. I looked at working for an actual impact-oriented startup, and I looked at venture capital and what that looked like, this overlay of kind of impact and VC, and was part of the impact investment fund at Stanford, which was really like helped kind of get my feet wet and seeing what that could actually look like. And then I also wanted to explore emerging technologies and their application for impact. And so that's where the blockchain research report that we worked on and then launched at the Skoll Forum in Oxford was really saying, okay, this was back, this was a number of years ago. So certainly at that time as well, it was like, okay, there's all this talk around the emergence of blockchain as a technology. What does this look like in terms of impact use cases? So, if you talk about aid disbursement, if you talk about identity, if you talk about land ownership, so far beyond kind of the initial just like monetary applications that we think about. So these were all like mini experiments that I ran, and ultimately just found that this sweet spot that I'm in now of early stage venture capital and social impact was just kind of like everything I was looking for. It sort of, I kind of stumbled it. It was a very like thoughtful and intentional process, and yet a little bit of luck and other things kind of just led me to the perfect spot. And I met the founding partners of Better Ventures while I was at Stanford, and their thesis, which and at that point they'd been around for about 7 years, but their thesis was that, and still is, that mission-driven founders and companies outperform the market. And that's exactly what I believed and what I'd kind of been looking for. And so we hit it off right away. And I joined the team. At the time, we were kind of on the getting to a point of closing the third fund, which we're now investing out of. And I've been here for the last 2.5 years.
That's amazing. And thanks for going through all the how you are approaching going back to school and your thought process, because I feel like there's a lot of people that if they haven't really figured out, they're in a career, haven't necessarily figured it out yet, it can be extremely helpful to just get clarity or take some time off and figure things out and what you really want and the industry you really want to be in and how you want to go about it. I think what you did, it was really interesting and I think could give some clarity to a lot of people out there maybe going through similar things.
I would like caveat that with it's not the only way to do it. And
For
also,
sure.
very aware of the fact that's not even an option for a lot of people. And I feel fortunate that it was for me. I think that one of my learnings would be for anyone that is looking at doing that. I think there's a way of running a similar process in different ways, right? But I think that for me, it was that kind of creating some time and space to step out, to take things apart, and then to kind of look at it in the way of running experiments to test different hypotheses about what this could look like, what you might want to do, what you're interested in, and what it could look like on the other side is a helpful process, like irrespective of whether that happens via business school or another means.
Yeah, and it's funny because that process is actually very similar to starting a startup and what founders go through, just like testing
Mm-hmm.
different hypotheses. And
Mm-hmm.
I like to phrase it too as life is like a buffet, right? There's so many different options and you can go through the line and try different things. There's endless things to try. But what you need to make sure of is if you don't like something, not to pick it back up and to go through until you find things that you like and get more of those. And it is very interesting. But I think it's very important for people to try different things and experiment and change things up if you're stagnating or if your energy is not there and you have to figure out a way to change that. It's so important for your mental health and everything, especially like with things that have gone on last 2 years right now. It's like
Absolutely. Yeah.
people need to be able to, do things that they care about, that they're passionate about, and that are important for them. But one of the biggest reasons that I started Entre and everything was because I saw how much more entrepreneurs were passionate about what they were working on a daily basis than other people. And
Mm-hmm.
it's something that, like, if we can get more people doing more work that they enjoy and are interested in and passionate about, the better everything's going to be. More work will get done, better work will get done, better quality work will get done, and we'll be solving real problems rather than just doing mundane work.
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of what we have. Our underlying thesis is that these mission-driven companies outperform, and a big part of that is the ability to attract talent. And I think that has been a trend that we've seen evidenced over the last few years, but even more so now with both kind of younger generations, which are coming through, and also with COVID. And people want to work for a company and or do a job that has meaning and has some positive impact. And you can define that in a lot of different ways. And I also encourage people who are looking for a more, what feels like a more impact driven career, to really explore what does impact mean for them, because that can mean a lot of different things. But ultimately, a lot of people are feeling that way. And generally there is a trend towards holding ourselves accountable in terms of what we do with our careers, holding companies accountable and to their role in society and for the planet. And so there's a big shift. And we see that translate into a distinct advantage for our companies because we're early stage investors. We have pretty early companies, early stage startups that are able to attract top talent in the Bay Area because of what they're doing, what they're solving for. And I think that's something like we all feel, but it also, as a founder and as an entrepreneur, is incredibly relevant because it actually translates into a real advantage in the market.
I agree with that. And I think it's going to be even more important going forward, especially for the next generation. Gen Z is even more impact driven and
Mm-hmm.
mission driven than millennials, right? So if you're not going to be, we're going through a massive transition with the workforce right now. Like all of
Absolutely.
these older generations, they're retiring. Millennials and Gen Z already make up over 50% of the workforce, and that number is only going to be growing. And all of these people are going to be around for the next 20, 30 years. And if most of them are focused on working for companies that are mission driven, impact driven, you're going to have a huge leg up on the competition. Totally agree with that. Before we wrap and get into, we'll take some questions here in a little bit. If anyone has any they would like to ask, just raise your hand and we'll bring a couple of people up before we wrap up. But I want to talk a little bit more about Better Ventures and things that you're excited about right now within your space. There's so much happening. What are, maybe if you have companies that you're really excited about, whether in your portfolio or not, or industries or different things that are happening within this impact investing space? What are you really excited about for the next few years or even beyond?
How much more time do we have?
Hey, we can keep going as long as I usually, I want to respect your time, but I'm wide open, so we can keep going for a while.
Great. Well, I'll keep it a little high level, but when you ask what I'm excited about, that's part of like why I love the job. So I could talk relatively endlessly. But so at Better Ventures, we invest across 3 themes. So we invest in climate, healthcare, and opportunity, which is education, workforce, kind of like we've been talking about a little bit already. And so, when we say, and as I said, like there's different ways of looking at impact, the way that we look at that is kind of those 2 dimensions. So one is the areas that we're investing in, which is that we're really looking for like technology driven companies that are solving problems in those 3 areas. And then the other lens is that we very specifically are looking for mission driven founders. And that may seem like a subjective, kind of lens, but it becomes pretty clear when you talk to a founder and you start digging into why they're building this company and why they're passionate about solving this problem. When you have a founder that either has a deep personal experience or just has that level of passion for really making a difference in the climate, in part of the healthcare system, that again, talk about an advantage. There is nothing that can replace that level of like hustle, drive, and fire than wanting to change like the mental health care system, for example. So that's how we think about impact, and those are the areas that we invest in. Across all of those, there's so many different things we could go into. You mentioned already as well, like how much is happening in the climate tech and sustainability space. We've been around for 10 years, and for many years, we were one of the only ones that was talking about this stuff. And some of our founding partners will share stories about their first fundraising conversations where they were literally being like laughed out of the room talking about investing in some of these things. And now there's people clamoring for opportunities, and it's very competitive. So there's a ton that's happening in the climate space. Healthcare as well. I mean, obviously COVID has put a lot of strain on the healthcare system, but also opened up a tremendous amount of opportunity in telehealth. We made an investment last year in a mental behavioral health company. So that's something that we care a lot about, but also has really been the need for has been emphasized, and the market opportunity is even greater now. And then on opportunity, so the way that we look at that, and a lot of people talk about future of work, and for us, given our impact focus, what that really means for us is focusing on underserved parts of the workforce and on alternative pathways to work and career. And some of that we've talked about even in like my own journey, and you've shared some of yours, but really looking at like on one side, if you look at a lot of what we think about in future of work is what is the future of kind of the corporate world, right? In terms of tools and technologies. And that's certainly a part of it. But what we look at is for the majority of US workers, like over 50% of in the US don't even have a bachelor's degree. So what are these people doing? So we talk about middle skills jobs. We talk about industries like manufacturing, skilled trades, healthcare, and both in terms of what are the educational pathways that help people find career paths and jobs. What does the access to those jobs look like in terms of visibility, equitable exposure, hiring? What is then mobility? And this is something I spend a lot of time on around upskilling and reskilling. So many people enter a field or a job, especially if you're looking at more hourly level or middle skill type jobs, and there's just very little opportunity for advancement. And that creates kind of this multi-generational level of stagnation in terms of mobility. And so I look a lot at how do we enable greater upskilling and reskilling within those parts of the economy and workforce. Look a lot at independent and gig work, which is kind of shifting away from this reliance on big companies, big institutions. What are ways in which we can better support gig workers, freelancers, creators? And then trades. I spent 6 years living in Switzerland, where not everyone goes to college or university. There's a viable path to go into the trades as an apprentice. And so also looking a lot at kind of what's the next version of apprenticeship type models and more skills based, pathways to jobs. So that's a lot to pack in, but there's so much that I'm excited about there because we're seeing such fundamental shifts in the economy and labor force, massive gaps, and a lot of really underserved industries where technology just hasn't really yet been applied. So a lot we're looking at. We also have a couple companies in our portfolio already in that realm. We have a company called SMBX, which has created small business bonds for that's an alternative to small business lending. My Village, which is a platform for childcare providers to kind of build their businesses and create greater supply in the childcare market. West 10th, which supports home-based, kind of independent home-based businesses. Again, like a lot of people who either out of necessity or desire left a traditional career path and are building their own skill-based business from home. And we're just now about to make an investment in a company that's in this skills-based hiring space, and that's applying data science and machine learning to enable this mobility for middle skills workers. So there's a lot there. I don't know how much time you want to spend on it, and that's just like one category, but a lot of really exciting stuff and a very interesting time in the market.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack within this. And I think like everything that you mentioned, it just gets me excited because I'm so into the future of work and figuring all of this out because there's so many variables involved with it. And for us, we want to help people navigate this. We want to be the platform and the network to help people find work, get work, start companies, all of that in an ecosystem that supports it. And I do think what is interesting, especially with you being in California right now, with everything going on with Prop 22 and the whole Uber, Lyft, and the gig worker thing, because I think I don't know the exact number of people, but there's a lot of people that are making money and using this either as full-time or using it as a way to just make extra cash or side hustle for their families and everything else. And it seems like a lot of people, and I don't know the sentiment out there, but I think you might be able to give people a better idea of what's actually happening right now, because it seems like there's actually a initiative to actually try to overturn it. So I don't know if you want to fill people on what's going on with that, but I think it's really important.
Absolutely. It really is. And I think this has and will continue to play out in many other geographies as well. But yeah, I mean, kind of fundamentally, for those who aren't familiar, a lot of the drivers and gig workers, this is ultimately their full-time job. And yet they've been able to be classified as contractors rather than full-time employees, which means that these companies are not required to provide benefits and various other things. So there's this whole kind of class of worker that has risen and became even more critical during COVID. Certainly, when you look at at delivery and logistics and many other types of frontline workers, and yet have been just fundamentally underserved and undersupported by the workforce and by these companies because they don't have access to benefits. They have very little income stability, very little resources. They don't own their own data. And one of the big it's funny you kind of mentioned this, but there's a company out here called Para who started, and it's a really fascinating one to dig into if you're curious about this, ex-Uber guy, and they basically started a platform for these gig workers and these delivery workers to effectively be on their platform. And the longer term vision effectively is that then Uber and these other companies kind of hire through them or kind of fill in work through them rather than the drivers being reliant on these multiple different platforms. So what happens now is you have an individual gig worker or driver, and they're working across 3 to 5 different gig platforms, DoorDash, Uber, Lyft, and others, and they're kind of having to switch back and forth between. And yet in the meantime, they have very little way of actually optimizing their own income, of accessing benefits from any of those employers, if you will, and they don't own their data. And that's a big part of it, which is that they are kind of beholden to these platforms and in terms of what they're earning and what they're able to actually see and optimize of their own schedules. And So there's been a big shift, and that's what Para's working on, and there have been others too that are really focused on how do we flip that? How do we actually empower the worker to have their own data and to be paid adequately, to have a better safety net of benefits? And so it's a big battle because doing so obviously is hugely detrimental to some of these very large companies so who are reliant on this part of the workforce. So it's a fascinating development in kind of the gig economy. And I think that the tide is shifting a bit in that there's a lot more power on the worker side and there's an ability to organize. And it has some remnants of the next version of a labor union because they had here multiple times, the most recent one within the last month or so, where drivers went on strike. And it'd be very interesting to see how it all evolves. But I think we're on the cusp of a bit of a shift towards a worker-led labor market, which has not been the case, certainly in the gig economy, for a long time, if ever, really.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens because I've noticed too, prices on Uber and Lyfts are going back to where now it's easier for people to just get a cab, especially in New York. But like, it's really funny what's happening, and I think this decision and future ones, I think we need to make sure we're carefully doing it and making sure it's the right thing and the best thing for everybody, because if the companies can't afford it, then the prices for consumers goes up, which people are just going to drive or figure out other take public transportation, and there's no actual work for the drivers. Then if they're employees, then the companies are going to let them go or hire way less people. So it's really interesting, and it is tricky. There's a company here in Pittsburgh too that is doing kind of a similar thing. They were focused on more rural areas than cities, and they wanted to hire the employees and focus on other parts of the country that aren't necessarily high population, but still need this service, right? Because it is important and something that a lot of people need. And there's a lot of different scenarios where people want a ride and can't get one.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's going to be very interesting. I think it's going to apply also to not just Uber and Lyft, but other industries that are going to, that rely on gig workers and marketplaces and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's multiple factors to what's created some of that constraint. There are a lot of businesses and sectors that have really struggled to hire and to fill demand, and whether that's kind of hourly workers, restaurants, food service, really like across many different types of work. And some of that has been influenced by levels of government support and kind of the trade-offs between unemployment and taking the risk of being a frontline worker. A lot of people also have caregiving needs and responsibilities at home, and that has been exacerbated during COVID. And so going out and working a frontline type gig job is just too much of a risk or not an option. And there are other alternatives. And so there has been a real and continues to be a real gap in terms of need for hiring in some of these sectors and types of jobs. And it's turned into a real, almost like, certainly in the driver's segment, like a competition for workers. So I think that we are really experiencing a bit of a shift because we have become so reliant on, and like we always have been to a certain extent, but I think it's become even more apparent as we've optimized for convenience and other things. If you just look alone at like last mile logistics and delivery, it's a huge market and a huge part of the workforce that like really wasn't as much the case before. So that's definitely something I'm very interested in terms of workforce. And part of that is some of the elements we've talked about. Part of it too is like there are also people who would rather work a job like that rather than, I always talk to my drivers. I always ask them, how long they've been doing this, why they're doing it. And it's fascinating. And there are a lot which are like, I would, given the choice, I'd rather do this than work behind a counter all day in the grocery store or whatever it may be. How do we, in a way, enable that flexibility or that optionality, but do so in a way that's more sustainable, that in some way provides better access to benefits or even mobility, which is okay. If you are an excellent driver or gig worker for 5 years and you provide great service and you go above and beyond and you're a great driver, like those skills could apply to other things. So how can you then use that as like almost a credential or a track record to say, okay, this person could also be great in an entry-level sales job if they want to do that. So I think like that link is quite interesting in terms of enabling mobility, and that just doesn't exist yet.
Totally. And you brought up a really interesting point, and this is something that I've had to deal with myself, and I know a lot of other people have had to deal with too, which is as entrepreneurs, when you're starting out, it's really tricky with, healthcare and benefits and all the stuff for yourself too, right? There's not really great ways of any good programs or healthcare companies or insurance companies that focus specifically on entrepreneurs. And I've also talked to a lot of people who literally stay in their job and because of the benefits of it. And that's the only reason that they're staying. So I think there's also an underlying issue of if all of these gig workers could get affordable, reliable healthcare and insurance from a provider, why they wouldn't necessarily we wouldn't even need to go through this Prop 22 situation at all. And I think it holds a lot of people back of becoming entrepreneurs too, because they're like, well, not only is it's tricky on the financial side, but it's also tricky just like from what if something happens to me or my family? Now we have to pay more, and it's not, maybe we don't have all the coverage that we used to have. So I think that's also something that I've noticed that is kind of an underlying issue that I wish was talked about more. I don't know if you've noticed that too, or what your thoughts are on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And what that plays into is kind of a lack of equity in terms of who even can consider becoming a founder or have access to capital. And so when you talk about the stats around venture capital funding that goes to founders of color, it's still dismal. It's absolutely dismal. And, there's some of that is tackling inherent bias in the funding ecosystem. But part of it too is that there are other barriers and challenges in place that just completely change the risk equation for someone considering being a founder, an entrepreneur, when if you have other financial responsibilities or caregiving responsibilities at home, access to networks and to resources, to role models, to support systems, like there are so many barriers in place. And when you think about what impact does that have, there's a real component of the lack of equity there. And that's something that we do talk a lot about in the industry out here. And I think there's more a dialogue around than there has been in the past, but we're still far from where we need to be in really acknowledging that and course correcting for it.
100% agree on that. And I'm very excited to see. I think all of this is going to get worked out over the next, hopefully 5 to 10 years. I think there's going to be a lot of changes with education, with the new generation, and just college debt in general. And before I'm going to bring Jonathan. Looks like he has a question here, and we'll see what's up, Jonathan. How are you? Did you have a question for Lyndsey?
Yeah. Hey, Mike. Hey, Michael. Sorry for the noise. I'm in New York. There's so much noise here.
All good.
That's a very like authentic New York sounding background.
Yeah, and I'm trying like to go for a side street, like to get a void from the siren. All right. So hey, Lyndsey. Sorry,
Hi.
Jonathan Fishner. Work a lot in the startup industry, and for a long time, and being part of Fiverr in the early stage for a few years as a developer. And a lot of things that you mentioned, I got really attached to. Basically, I'm also talking with the Uber and Lyft drivers and really care about them. And I think like that's part of like when I've been in Fiverr to see that like the gig economy and how it's globalized and providing work for a lot of people is something that really touched me and make me like take the decision for stay there. And I wanted to ask about if you ever think about, I know that you are coming from a banking and a financial background, but have you ever like thought about being a founder? And if so, why you decide not to, or it's never been in your head?
Yeah, great question. I definitely have at various points throughout my career, really. I think both in Hong Kong, at one point I'd like started a little bit of a side business just because I had that itch, and that was actually around creating community around events and community. I've always been like a community builder. So it was more of a passion project that turned into a little side business, but it was a fun experiment. And then when I was at Stanford, certainly, as I said, so many people are starting companies down there and at Stanford that it's an incredible opportunity to do it, and was very tempted to do so. I think that what ended up being the distinction for me is that I realized that I really love working with a portfolio of kind of problems and people. So I really enjoyed the variety of being able to work across climate, and then the next day dig in on behavioral health, or the next day be looking at, how are we supporting small businesses. So I realized that I love that level of flexibility and like intellectual curiosity across many things, more so than I like being really deep in one. And I also realized that I love being in that role of like an advisor, mentor, connector. That's just something I've always really enjoyed and am great at and kind of thrive in. And so I think it was a combination of those two things where I felt like there wasn't a specific problem that I felt like this is the thing I want to, if I'm going to start a company, this is like the thing that I want to do. And I'd always been really clear about, I don't want to start a company just for the sake of starting a company. And that's, kind of like the ethos of the types of founders that we back. Like I only wanted to do it if there was something that I felt so compelled and passionate about doing that it really felt like kind of my mission. And I didn't have that necessarily towards one particular thing. And I didn't want to join like a startup team or start something just for the sake of feeling like that's what I needed to do. And yeah, and I love the variety. I just love working across many different things and different types of problems and problem areas. And ultimately, too, part of it is looking at the founders we work with are so incredibly brilliant in what they do. A lot of them have PhDs. We work with pretty strong science and technology founded companies. And so it's also looking at, in a way, I feel I'm better suited in a supporting role to these people than I am doing it myself, because they're just so incredibly brilliant. So there's a level of forced humility in that decision too.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Thanks for sharing. And if it's okay, I have another question. Just
Fine for me.
like have you ever like did a angel investment before? And if you're okay to share like about the experience, or only with like a VC?
Yeah. So I have done a little bit of angel investing. I feel in a way I'm pretty like overweighted into the startup world already. So I think that there's advantages to being exposed to and having access to amazing deals and founders and things that we wouldn't be in scope for us at Better Ventures that I'm able to do personally. And I have made a few angel investments with my own capital. I'd say that with that, there's a couple things that I keep in mind. For me, it's always been very important that those investments are aligned to my values. And so I have only and would only back a founder that was building something that was impactful. So it doesn't necessarily the same categories of what we invest in at the fund, but that in itself is important for me and remains important, whether that's in sustainability or in another market or sector. I'm a little more flexible with that personally, but need to see that it's an impact focused company and founder. That's not just what I do professionally, that's also what I care about. I also use it as a way to support founders that might not have access to other capital by just doing small checks and helping them get off the ground. So that's one of my personal areas of commitment to impact, is supporting underrepresented founders in that way through some of those angel checks. And then ultimately, the way that I think about it from an investing perspective is, as I said, like I'm already pretty overweight and exposed on startups and kind of private markets. And I think it's a great way to, especially if you're not in the industry, to start to learn and to experiment, to learn, to be exposed to things you wouldn't otherwise. I think like just do so with a lot of caution. Most don't work out. It's a very risky asset class of investing, and do your homework, but also more importantly just know what level of risk is suitable for you. I think it's kind of, there's a lot of people now doing angel investing, and I think that's great because it's opening up access to capital. It's also really important to do so with a percentage of your personal capital that you can take a risk with, because it's an incredibly risky way of investing. It can also help generate significant returns, but it's highly risky. I say it with all of that as a caveat. I am open to and will continue to do a little bit myself. But yeah, I also see the the downsides of it too. So do so with caution and knowing what you're getting into.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And happy to be here in this call.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you for
Jonathan.
joining.
Thanks, Lyndsey. All right. As we wrap up here, are there any closing words of wisdom that you haven't already said for founders out there? Any common mistakes or things that you've seen successful founders do really well, that because most of the people here listening are entrepreneurs or are interested in that. Do you have any final piece of advice for founders? And I'm also going to pull up, and as you're talking this, I'm going to share your website for Better Ventures and everything too, so people can check that out at the same time.
Great. I'll focus on two things. One, in terms of as a founder, and one in interacting with investors. So on the founder side, and I would say that this is obviously what we see, but depending what you're building, but find out how you can tap into that, the core of that like mission and that motivation for yourself. If you're thinking about building something, I would highly encourage you to think about a way of building something that matters. And, that can mean a lot of different things, and that's fine. But really thinking about, there are incredible market opportunities in, some of these areas that we've talked about, where you can build like a highly impactful business that also is having a significantly positive impact on the world. And if you're thinking about doing something, I would highly encourage to explore that intersection for yourself and figure out what that could look like for you. As I said, I think it does really just like translate into an incredible advantage as you build a company. And then on the investor side, I would say the biggest thing that I see in terms of just outreach, very open to cold outreach from founders. And I think a lot more funds and investors are than you may realize. But do your homework in that outreach. If you're wanting an investor to take time to look at what you send or speak to you, take time also to look at the website, listen to the podcast, read the blog, and really understand like what they care about and what's relevant for them and what you're doing. And if it's not, like, don't reach out, or do so in a way that there's some relevant intersection point. I get so much outreach that's just very clear that they haven't really taken the time to even look if this is something that we invest in. And that's just never going to work. So cold outreach can work really well, but do put the work into it to focus in on who really is relevant for you and why, and tailor your messaging. Otherwise, there's a lot of noise. So be thoughtful about that, and don't be afraid to reach out. Warm intros are great, but a lot of investors are very open to cold outreach if it's done thoughtfully and done well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think a lot of founders, they tried just the spray and pray approach. And I've noticed that building relationships and genuinely reaching out and being authentic with it is, even if it takes a lot longer and you don't reach as many, it usually ends up working out much better anyway in the long run.
Yeah,
I do want
to be targeted. Yeah.
Exactly. Because I get hit up all the time on LinkedIn and emails just for all sorts of stuff, mostly software and development and things like that. And I can tell very quickly if this is just a generic email or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you can do the same on the investing side as well. And
yeah,
real quick,
absolutely.
I did. So you guys just became, I think this is really interesting. This summer, you guys just became a B Corp as a fund, which is really interesting. How many are there, because this is kind of like the first time I've actually seen this. Is that a new thing, or have you been seeing other funds that are going in this direction as well?
Yeah, I mean, on the fund side, to be honest, I don't know that I've seen another. I'm sure that that exists.
That's what I don't think I have either.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
It's definitely not common. I think for us, and we've talked about this for a long time, for years, in fact, and then finally went through the process to do it. It's kind of like walking the talk, right? Like this is what we stand for, our companies, and the way that we invest and what we want to represent as a firm. And we just felt like it was important to represent that in some way. We've been big supporters of B Corp for a long time. Where relevant, we think it's a big advantage for companies to be a B Corp for that signaling effect of what we talked about in terms of attracting talent and other things. And we felt like, hey, if this is what we believe and what we stand for, we should be doing this as well. And we did that. I'm very excited that we finally got there and kind of got certified. And it's definitely something that we recommend. It is a process. It takes a little bit of time and resource, but if becoming fully B Corp certified isn't an option for you as a founder, what is helpful is to look at what does it take to become certified, and think about those things early as you build out various processes within the company, or as you think about like policies around hiring, around the environmental impact. And you can use it as a bit of a framework to just like how you set up, and then maybe the actual certification becomes an option as you grow or become larger down the road. But yeah, we're really excited to do that. Thanks for mentioning it, and we hope that more will follow.
Yeah, absolutely love it. And it's something that I would love to also do with Entre down the line. I think it's important for us, just as a company and how we're approaching the new wave of professional networking and social networking. I think it's important for us to always remain mission driven and focused on actually making an impact with the entrepreneurs and creators and freelancers that are in our community, and will continue to help as we evolve. Absolutely love that. Lyndsey, where can people learn more? Where would you like people to reach out if they think they're a fit for what you're doing or want to get in contact? What would be the best place for people to find you?
Yeah. So certainly check out our website, which I know that you highlighted, but it's www.better.vc, and certainly on Twitter and LinkedIn as well. If you want to reach out to me personally, you can reach out at missiondriven@better.vc. And I check that. I kind of run that inbox. And so if you're interested to reach out, ask questions, or share information on what you're working on, feel free to do that. I try and be responsive. We do get a little inundated, but certainly very open to outreach. And the other way to reach me personally is on LinkedIn as well.
Alrighty. And I cannot wait to have in-room chat here so that we can just drop links and stuff in the room. And for those of you listening, we are doing these interviews live now on Entre, so you can come on, tune in live before the recording hits Spotify and Apple Podcasts and everything, and ask questions like Jonathan did tonight. Lyndsey, thank you so much for being here. This was awesome. Better.vc, and please follow up with her genuinely and authentically. And if you do have anything else that we can help you with here at Entre, please let us know. But Lyndsey, thank you so much. This was amazing, and I hope you have a great rest of your night and a great weekend.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. I really enjoyed it, and looking forward to staying in touch.
Thanks, Lyndsey. Take care. See everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of The Entrepreneur Show. If you'd like to connect and network with other like-minded people, entrepreneurs, investors, freelancers, and startups, check out our app or go to our website, joinentre.com. Thank you so much for being a part of our community. If there's anything that we can do to help you, please reach out to us and let us know.